Well, Scott, thanks so much for joining me on the Minimalist Moms podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about your new book today. It's called Get
Me
Better at
too.
Anything at 12 Maxims for Mastery. But before we get into it, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get into the conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing about learning for a really long time. I've had a blog since 2006 where I've been writing weekly essays on the subjects of self improvement, productivity, and of course, learning and education. And I wrote a 2019 Wall Street Journal bestselling book, Ultra Learning, which was about some of my projects, learning things intensively like languages and computer science and portrait drawing and other things like that. And I've this most recent book, Get Better at Anything, is sort of my deep dive into the science of how we learn and trying to package that in a format that someone who wants to get better at anything can use it as a roadmap for improvement.
Absolutely. And like you said, you do have this is your second book that you've written.
hmm
So I'm wondering what prompted you to write this one and how it may vary from that first book that you wrote, which was called Ultra Learning, correct? Is that what you
Yeah.
said?
Ultra
Okay.
learning. Yeah. The two books, I mean, they both have a similar kind of idea behind them of how do we get better at learning. The first one was a little bit more inspired by my kind of personal experiences and some of the projects that other people had done that inspired me. So the focus of that book was on people who took on kind of intensive self-directed learning projects. These people I called ultra learners. So people who are, learning a language in 3 months and they're dedicating themselves to it, or you know, building their own video game and learning the art and music and all the things at once. Whereas this one, it kind of started with me just doing a lot of research. I started reading more and more about the science of learning, and that kind of eventually coalesced this picture. And I was like, well, you know what? I've got a lot of stuff here that I didn't get a chance to talk about in the first book, so I decided to write another one. And so the books have different flavors, but I think they're both useful for someone who wants to understand how learning works, so they can avoid some of the pitfalls, and so that they can improve the skills that matter to them.
Absolutely. I thought you started off your books in such an interesting way. You were talking about
Mm,
Tetris. Tell me a little
yeah.
bit more about how that Tetris, the game, is relatable to this topic.
Yeah. So Tetris is a really interesting example because the game came out like kind of late 80s, early 90s, and it was a real phenomenon. Like it was, there were these op-eds being written about how people are like hallucinating falling blocks because they're playing the game so much that they're doing it. But if you look at the actual best players, like the sort of high scores, so they've been keeping high scores since the beginning of the game, like the best scores people were doing. It's incredible how bad people were back then. Like, so how much better the best Tetris players are today. And it's a sort of an interesting question of like why would players be so much better today? And you can rule out a few immediate explanations. So it's not just that it's the same players and they're just getting steadily better over 30 years, because some of the best players today are only like 12 or 13 years old. These are just kids. So they weren't even born when the game came out. And other explanations also don't really make a lot of sense. So, you can also sort of easily dismiss the idea that, oh, well, they're just practicing some different way. The difference seems to be that in the sort of 2000s, that kind of time period, all of a sudden, people who were playing these games seriously started live streaming. They started showing how they were actually performing and doing the skill. And so a lot of quite, sort of esoteric techniques that would be hard to just figure out just through random gameplay, people are learning through observation. And so Tetris is kind of a sort of a silly example, but this turns out that it shows up in lots of different places. So we can see in like the history of science, for instance, when it was alchemy compared to chemistry, it was alchemists. It was really hard to learn what they were doing. And so it was really hard to form a stable science off of that. So this became kind of the kernel of the idea of the book, that we know most of what we know from other people. And so the ease of learning from other people is a major determinant of how much we can learn and indeed master ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. You have a little diagram right after the story that says that we learn better when we're connected to each other because we
Mhm.
somehow learn from their failure, their mistakes, and or what they're doing well,
Right.
which is one of my next questions for you because I've heard you say before that it might not be necessarily true that you learn best from failure. So, what is the
Yeah.
research showing?
Well, I mean, so there is a kind of, all ideas are like this, where there's like something that's sort of true about it, but then sometimes it's taken too far. So obviously, it's the case that like we can't always control whether we're going to succeed and fail in life. And so it's very important to, persevere through failure. And indeed, sometimes when you have a failure, you can learn a lesson and learn a mistake from that. But the issue is that there's two major problems with learning from failures. The first problem is motivational. When you experience failure, that's a signal kind of from the environment that, oh, what you're doing is not rewarding. Maybe you should stop doing it. And so if you look at the broad scheme of things, the typical success story is not someone who just like endured through years and years of failure and then finally succeeded. It's they had some small successes and they built on those small successes to some bigger successes. And they continually got rewarding until they became more and more motivated, more and more self-confident. And then that built their success. And so I think if you're not sure which kind of person you are in the world, it's definitely better to start with building success for that motivational reason. But there's also an intellectual reason to want to build from success too, because if you can see the right way to do something and you can get success a lot faster in yourself, you reduce the amount of trial and error you need. A lot of skills are a little bit like trying to find the settings on a combination dial. Like you're trying to find the right way to do something. And if someone can say, oh yeah, this is the combination, do this, this, and this, and you try it out and it opens the lock, then you're done. If you have to try out 400 different combinations before getting it right, then not only are you going to be demotivated, but it's going to take you a lot longer to learn. So I think building off of success, when we can do that, is a very good thing. And it's certainly good if we're thinking about this for our children, because very often, we are in a position to give them that combination lock that we can open. And so withholding that unnecessarily, I think, is one of those, kind of these ideas that floats around in the sort of educational space that I think is less valuable than it seems.
Yes, absolutely. I guess that makes so much sense because if I'm just failing time and time again,
Mm.
I'm probably going to just stop working towards that goal. I mean, especially if it's something that I don't have to do, which is my next question for you. There are going to be things that we don't necessarily want to learn, but must for a job. Or I
Mhm.
guess I don't really have any students necessarily listening, but might have to do that for school. Is there a difference in the research in regards to things that we aren't as interested in learning? Can we still learn them as easily?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The motivation is interesting in this way. Like there's lots of people who have studied, for instance, the difference between like performance motivation and mastery motivation. So there's people who are, driven to succeed to get an A plus in the class versus people who are sort of intrinsically they want to learn the material. And, sometimes people have a performance motivation, they maybe learn in a more shallow way because, they're just trying to ace the exam, they don't care. Whereas students who really want to master the material often learn it in a deeper way, even if they're also trying to get a good grade. And I think in terms of motivation, one of the things that I really try to practice with myself and I try to encourage other people to practice is reframing. Because I think one of the problems is that often you can get yourself into a situation where something is not immediately appealing. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something that you could find interesting about it. It's just that it requires a little bit of work. It's a little bit like, the dish that's a little bit complex or a little bit interesting tasting. You have to kind of approach it not just like, oh, this is a glazed donut that is just going to be yum immediately. It's going to be saying, okay, I have to sort of savor this and appreciate it a little bit. So a few different ways you can motivate yourself to find that kind of intrinsic motivation that will pull you through something. So one is to sort of ask how something is useful. So even if you don't find it intellectually stimulating, you can ask, what is it used for? So if this is not just an instrumental goal, like getting a job, but this is why this knowledge is going to be beneficial in that job or why it's going to help me in my success as a student or as a professional. There's the idea of figuring out, well, what could be intellectually interesting about this? So, sometimes you approach a subject and you have a dry teacher who's just sort of giving you like the most boring lecture. And if you dig a little deeper, maybe there is actually something interesting to it. Like I remember the first time I encountered economics, I had this teacher that was just, it was the worst lecturer ever. Like no one could understand. It's just graphs and charts and it's very, very dry. But economics is actually a really interesting subject. And it took me a little while to find that. But I think you have to dig a little deeper than the research. So you have to look up on Wikipedia, look at some like YouTube explainers that are a little bit more fun and engaging. And you can often find, okay, this is what I connect with this subject. And then the third thing is even just like an intellectual challenge. Some of the things that are the most dry material possible can still be interesting if you treat it as like a puzzle for your own mind. Like, how can I get my mind to wrap around this particular challenge? So I think
Mhm.
about people who compete in like memory competitions, for instance, where the thing they're memorizing is like the most boring thing imaginable. But the challenge is like, how do you get your mind to work fast enough to actually memorize that information? So it can be actually really exciting, even if the material itself is kind of dull.
Yeah. I homeschool my 9-year-old, and I always tell her with math, just think about this. Don't put pressure on yourself to feel like I mean, it's obviously a big deal, but don't
Hmm.
look at it that way. I think if we can make it more fun and just this is all a learning process, it helps her succeed a little bit better. But I want to go into your book. You talk about the three, well, I guess these are three ways to get better, and it's see, do, feedback. And I'm curious, I don't know, hopefully this is a question that's
Yeah.
valid. Is there anything to be said about when people are like, "Oh, I'm a visual learner,"
Yeah.
versus I do it myself and get hands-on practice?
Well, so I think first of all, to preface, like it's definitely true that there's lots of skills that you need the hands-on practice. I mean,
Okay.
no one's learned to play tennis by like reading a book, right? And I think depending on the skill, the sort of locus of difficulty might be different. So, like as we mentioned, some skills, the real difficulty is figuring out what works. And so, if someone could just tell you do this, then there's nothing else to it. You just do that. And then in other things, you need the practice, you need the feedback from the environment. So, an entrepreneur really depends on feedback because yes, you can learn in theory what works, but you still need to like test, do people actually want to buy my particular product? And same with practice. I mean, you can uh go to all the, listen to all the piano concertos you want, but unless you're actually tapping with your fingers on the piano keys, you're not going to build up that procedural skill that's necessary for doing that. But in
Yeah.
terms of like learning styles, this is a really popular idea that like I think people gravitate toward because they do recognize these different modalities in learning are very important.
Mhm.
But the research doesn't seem to be for the idea that if you can kind of like tune your environment to a particular sort of learning modality, you're going to get better results. And I think that's probably because our brains are more the same than they are different. So even though some people seem to learn faster than other people, the way they learn, the basic machinery seems to be pretty similar across people. And so I think that's something that's also it's also promising because it shows that if other people can do it, you can probably do it too if you find the right way to do it.
Okay.
No worries.
So you have a podcast episode on this next
Hmm.
question I have for you. And it's
Sure.
that idea of the 10,000 hour rule, which I think Malcolm
Hmm.
Gladwell talks about that in
Yeah.
Outliers, which I read years ago. But are you seeing maybe there's new research that
Hmm.
disproves it or continues to, what are you seeing?
Well, I mean, so the 10,000 hour rule is like one of those things, especially if you're in like the learning space, everyone asks you about, and it's become this meme that is sort of like exists detached of any reference source. So I don't want to pick on Malcolm Gladwell specifically, although there's definitely stuff that I probably disagree with him about. But
Yeah.
his idea was originally drawn from Anders Ericsson, as well as some other researchers who found that there's these sort of longer training periods required to become world class at something.
Mhm.
So if you look at chess players, if you look at musicians, artists, the psychologist John Hayes found that it was like about 10 years was sort of necessary, depending on the field, to become world class at something. And it was sort of interesting, like how solid this sort of barrier seemed to be. That like even in fields like creative arts, for instance, it wasn't the case that you had some people producing their masterpieces in year two. Like it took about like 6 to 10 years, even for everyone to get to that point where they start producing
Yeah.
masterpieces, which suggests that there is this sort of like amount of practice that you need to accumulate. Now, I think some of the problems with 10,000 hours is first problem is that people think, oh, if I just do something enough, AKA I do something for 10,000 hours, I will become world class at that. And the
Mm.
research, I think, is actually completely the opposite. That part of the reason that Anders Ericsson created this whole deliberate practice concept
Mhm.
was to deal with the fact that most people spend at least 10,000 hours doing their jobs, and very few of us are world class at what we do. There's tons of lawyers out there, very few people are world class lawyers. There's tons
Sure.
of chess players, very few people are international grandmasters or this kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that he found was that you need to do this kind of deliberate practice in order to make improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything we can't get better at?
Hmm. I mean, the things we can get better at are pretty broad. I think that was one of the things that Anders Ericsson should have showed is that they're like a lot of these things, if you practice them, you can get good at them. So like an example that I think often surprises people is like you can get better at IQ tests if you just practice IQ tests. So if you just
Mm.
go and you just like practice the questions that they give an IQ test, you probably will get a higher IQ score. Now, whether
Mhm.
that's a valid measurement of your intelligence anymore is an open question, but I think it does show that most things are amenable to practice and learning and study. So in this sense, I think we should be optimistic. You can get good at a lot of things. I think one of the sort of misconceptions, though, is how broad that improvement is. So sometimes people have this idea that if I do this specific kind of practice activity, so my favorite sort of like example of this is like brain training. Like I'm going to do these puzzles on my phone and it's going to make me good at all these other kinds of activities. And this is where the research shows it's a little bit disappointing that when you practice things, you tend to get good at what you practice. There's a bit of a halo of skills that are sort of related to what you've learned that you benefit from. So, for instance, the people who get PhDs in physics often go on to work on Wall Street. And it's in theory like physics and finance are different, but they depend on a lot of the same math. So you get this transfer from the skills being the same in some sort of essential way. And so
Yeah.
I think this idea that when we improve, there's like kind of a almost nothing that we can't improve, at least to some degree, but that when we do work on it, we have to practice the right things because that practice will be specific to what we're trying to improve.
Are you trying to get better at anything right now?
I'm trying to get better at lots of things. I mean, I'm trying to get better at my podcast interviews, so you'll have to give me some feedback on how I'm doing on this one
Oh
here.
my
But I
gosh,
think
no. It's going great. It's horrible over here. You're managing this very well, the chaos from
I was gonna say, I there's lots of things that I want to improve. I mean, I
Mm.
want to improve my skills as a writer. I want to improve my ability to do research, but also like just personally, like I want to be a better parent to my kids. I want to, be a better listener with my wife, which she will attest I'm not always the best at. I want to be better at like hobbies I have. I like skiing, I like painting. I'd like to be better at them. I'm just sort of mediocre at them. And so I think this sort of idea of like, wouldn't it be cool if you were better at this is probably the reason that I spend most of my time researching this because this is such a fundamental drive. And I think it's something that if you can kind of unlock, oh, okay, this is how it works. This is what kinds of efforts I should make if I want to get better. I think it'd be very valuable.
Did you see in research that there's somewhat of a threshold of how many things we can attempt to get better at one time? Because I'm like
Mm,
you. I'm like, oh, I want to get better at this, this, and
yeah.
this. And it kind of seems like every area is not as maybe if I honed my focus on one or two
Mhm.
things, I would succeed a lot quicker than I am with my attention split in all these different areas.
Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated question. So there's a few parts. The first part is just that because of what we talked about, that like every skill is a little bit separate from each other. The more things you learn, the more you're diluting how much time you're spending. So if you learn 18 sports, obviously you're only putting 1/18th of the time in each. So if you needed, 1,000 hours to get really good at tennis or to like become okay at tennis, and you're spending 1/18th of the time, it's going to take you a lot longer. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is that it's hard to maintain the ability to pursue a lot of different goals at the same time. And so this is why I've often advocated picking one project at a time. The project doesn't have to be long. Doesn't mean you have to commit to like, tennis for a decade. It could be a month where you're focused on tennis. But the reason is that, to engage in some kind of self-improvement effort, you're going to have to set aside time, you're going to have to set aside goals, you're going to have to like monitor your progress and make adjustments whether okay, what I'm doing right now is not working, let's try something else. And all of these things are kind of a tax on your overall daily operating system. And so, if you're like me and yourself and you have kids and you have other life responsibilities, your sort of mental bandwidth for this sort of life tax of like, I'm going to work on things is probably pretty thin. And so it probably benefits you to take on maybe one project where, you have a single goal and you're focused on that goal. In terms of like cognitively speaking, like, can you learn multiple things at once? I don't think there's anything that prevents you from doing that. Indeed, like in university classes, you typically take like 5 different classes at the same time
Yeah.
if you're a full-time university student. And I don't think there's anything like negative about that. In some cases, there might be a positive because in doing so, you spread out the material and then you get advantage of the spacing effect. But from a practical standpoint, for someone pursuing individual learning goals, I tend to favor the fewer projects philosophy just because the person who has 8 projects is probably not doing any of them. Whereas the person who has one
Yeah.
project maybe has a chance to make improvements.
Well, and the brain is malleable, so you can always add in and you can always learn. I feel like little kids probably can manage it better because they're like little sponges. I don't know. I'm kind of being redundant in what you've said.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious in regards to parenting and kids
Yeah.
and how we can take this conversation to
Mm.
most of my listeners are moms. How can we encourage our kids to get better at anything.
I was gonna say the most important thing that came out from me from the research is the importance of background knowledge. So the sort of speed at which someone will learn something, the ease at which they will acquire something, critically depends on what they already know that's related to that. So one of the classic findings is that students who come from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds that begin learning to read in first grade typically is when they start here at least, and when they start to read, some students, they are maybe already reading a little bit because their parents have been reading to them a lot. They know their letters. They've been singing their ABCs. They know how a book works, all this kind of stuff. And so when the teacher comes to explain letters and this kind of stuff, they already know. And then there's other kids that they don't know any letters, or they know one letter like X, or maybe the letter in their name, and that's it. And so basically these other kids are playing catch up, and they have to do so much more work to get to the same point as the other students. And often this sort of background knowledge is kind of invisible. So they may not even attribute it to like, oh, well, Jenny is obviously from this family. And so she already knows this. So, but like, don't worry, I'm just as smart as Jenny. I will catch up. No, they'll think to themselves, oh, I'm not good at reading, or I'm not good at this. And so I'm going to stop and I'm not going to try. And so I think two things are important there. One is that if you want your kids to learn things, you need to introduce them to lots of things. You need to give them lots of knowledge and support and information. I think that home environment is so critical for that. And second, if your kid is struggling with something, give them those building blocks. One of the big findings for learning to read is that phonics works really well. And so that's particularly true for students who struggle. So the students who just pick it up and then, oh, looks like little Jenny is just reading on her own. Maybe they don't need any specialized sort of pedagogical instruction, but lots of kids really do benefit from having teachers and parents break it down for them and sound out all the letters and carefully and methodically build up that skill, because that's really what's involved in learning to read. And I think you can apply that lesson to any skill or any set of knowledge or subject that you want your kids to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there any other word of wisdom or just takeaway that you want listeners to know when they pick up your book or from this conversation?
Well, I mean, it's not as scientific. It's not some sort of research derived point, but my sort of big takeaway is that anyone can learn anything that they set their mind to. And I think you need to really begin with that optimistic starting point, because the world is busy. It's always chaotic. And often there's a lot of signals from the environment that are discouraging us and telling us that we can't get better at something. And I'm here to say that, yes, you can get better. And obviously, I think that knowing how learning works can help you avoid some of those obstacles. But if you start with that fundamental belief, I think you can go very far.
Absolutely. That's a great word of advice. Well, you go so much deeper into that see, do feedback. That's really how you've set up your book. So I'll
Mhm.
direct listeners there. The book again is called Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. Well, where can they find you and connect with you online and grab a copy of the book? Where is it available?
Sure. Yeah, so they can check out my website, scotthyoung.com. There's links to my podcast there as well, scotthyoung.com podcast. You can listen to some of my episodes there. And they can also, yeah, check out the books, Amazon, Audible, wherever you get your books from. And there's also Ultra Learning too, if they're interested in that one as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny. This is something
Mhm.
I guess I should have asked you. So you said Audible. That made me think.
Yeah,
Usually with books like this, nonfiction, I feel like
yeah,
I can understand them a lot more if someone's reading them to me. I always download
yeah.
nonfiction books. Is there anything to be said about that?
I don't know. So I did do a little like research look at some of the information on like different modalities for learning. So
Yeah.
like people are like ebook versus paper versus Audible, and like there's some studies that show some benefit. Like I've heard that paper tends to do better than digital, but in a lot of these studies, it's like you're doing it on like an iPad or something. So
Mhm.
there's sort of like this
Yeah.
inherent distractibility of it. I
Yeah.
I think for audio, I mean, for some people, certainly, like reading is an active cognitive process that's like on top of listening, like it's an additional skill. And
Yeah.
so that can increase the cognitive load of actually having to read the book. Whereas if you are, if you're listening, presumably, if it's your native language, you're used to listening. I think the
Mhm.
one disadvantage of audiobooks is we often have a tendency to like do them while we're doing something else. And like
Yeah.
that can be fine, like you're folding laundry, but like even for me, I like listening to audiobooks, and I'll often be like, oh, I missed that. What was that point they were saying? Whereas text, you would just go back and reread that
Yeah.
paragraph. So I think there can be differences. Personally, I would probably be more in favor of text if it's like a hard book that you really have to focus on and study. But
Mm.
certainly, and as you know, as like a busy parent, just like being able to listen to audiobooks, like, while you're, doing chores or while you're on your commute or this kind of thing. I mean, like, that can be a big chunk of your reading time, so I definitely wouldn't wanna discourage anyone from doing that.
Well, it probably I mean, I've been listening to podcasts for a good
Mhm.
15 years, early listener to podcasts,
Yeah.
and I just feel like I'm so used to being like, it feels like a lecture. If I'm listening to
Yeah.
the onset of this book, it feels like you're up in front of a classroom giving a lecture,
Mhm.
and I kinda like that. It just could be the way we're taking in information these days, but I didn't prompt you for these last 2 questions I have for
Yeah.
you. These are just rapid fire, get
Oh,
to
no,
know.
that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So, my last 2 questions. The first one is,
Sure.
what has been a beneficial resource in your life that you wanna share with the listeners?
Oh, wow, yeah, it's like the f "What's your favorite book?" question is is so
Sure,
hard
it's
because
kind
there's so
or like
many, right? Favorite
yeah,
resources on this particular topic, I really like Daniel Willingham's work. He's a Harvard-educated, cognitive psychologist, so he's written a couple books on learning, why I think it's "Why Do Kids Not Like School?" And then there's
okay.
another one, "Outsmart Your Brain." So he is sort of often one of my go-to sources for, like, what's the truth in this domain. So, it's hard to pick favorites, but I mean, that is one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'll add that to the show notes. And then my last question for you is, what is something that you can't stop talking about?
Ooh, what can I not stop talking about? Well, I mean, maybe it's wearing off a little bit, but I recently got a Fitbit, and I was like selling people
So
on getting a Fitbit, and they were gonna like, okay, okay, I don't want to get it. I was like, no, it's cool. You can track your heart rate, this kind of thing. But
yeah,
that's
yeah,
just me
yeah.
nerding out on that. A little bit off topic of what we're doing here.
No, I was the same way with my Apple Watch, and then I go in
Mhm.
waves where I'm like, "I don't really need to track this," but then I'm like,
Yeah,
"Oh, I wonder how I'm." I think anytime I
yeah.
stop making it fit like, act I'm like, "Oh, I gotta throw it
Mhm.
back on so I can monitor that."
Yeah. No, it's a good tool. I think a lot of our difficulties in our life is that our sort of our attentional environment has been like over engineered to
Mhm.
capture our attention in ways that don't really align with our goals. So it's like very easy to just like get down like some social media rabbit hole where you're like, what am I
Yeah.
doing? Like, why am I watching this? Whereas, all the things that we really like care about, like our productivity, our health, they're often like a lot less gamified, a lot, and so they're in this sort of kind of disadvantage in competing against some of the other things that are drawing our attention these days. So I don't know. I'm
Mhm.
always for the idea of using technology, using some of these tools in a way to further our goals.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were saying all of that, this actually aligned with getting better at anything. If you wanna
Yeah,
improve running, using this as could be a tool to help get you there, and it's a fun game like
yeah,
you were talking. So, full
absolutely.
circle, Scott. It's full circle.
Full circle. Yeah, always nice to
Yeah.
tie it in.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.